The shipping container had been sitting on Pier 7 of Camp Lemonier's logistics annex for 9 days before anyone looked inside it. It had arrived on March 13, 2026, aboard a Djibouti Ports Authority freight manifest as a consignment of commercial generator components destined for a French infrastructure contractor operating in the country's interior. The container's documentation was complete, professionally formatted, and consistent with 14 similar shipments that the same forwarding company had processed through Camp Lemonier's civilian freight interface over the preceding 8 months. The camp's logistics intake team had processed it in 11 minutes, assigned it a holding position on Pier 7 pending the contractor's collection vehicle, and moved on to the next item in a manifest backlog that had grown substantially since the conflict began, and the base's operational tempo had increased to levels that left every administrative function running at the edge of its available staffing. On March 22, 2026, a Naval Criminal Investigative Service Special Agent assigned to Camp Lemonier's Force Protection Element was cross-referencing the base's pending freight manifest against a counterintelligence alert that had arrived from the Defense Intelligence Agency 4 hours earlier. The alert documented a recently identified IRGC covert operations cell operating in the Horn of Africa region. A cell that DIA's source network assessed had been activated in the first week of March, with a tasking that involved the pre-positioning of disruptive capability against U.S. military logistics infrastructure in the region. The alert was 3 pages. It contained no specific target identification. It contained no specific timeline. It contained a note in the 3rd paragraph that the cell's known logistics methodology involved the use of commercial freight forwarding companies with established track records of legitimate business activity as cover for material movement. The special agent read that paragraph at 11:14 p.m. on March 22nd. She had been in NCIS for 9 years. She understood, from 9 years of reading counterintelligence assessments, the difference between a specific threat warning and a pattern indicator. And she understood that the DIA alert was a pattern indicator, not a warning, which meant that acting on it required exactly the kind of additional analytical work that the alert itself could not provide. She pulled the base's complete pending freight manifest at 11:19 p.m. She began working through it systematically, comparing each entry against the pattern indicators in the DIA alert. Forwarding company track records, documentation consistency, pickup scheduling behavior, origin routing. At 11:44 p.m., she reached the entry for the generator components container on Pier 7. The forwarding company had a clean 8-month track record. The documentation was complete. The pickup had been scheduled, then rescheduled twice. The second rescheduling had moved the collection date to March 25th. She flagged it at 11:47 p.m., not because any single element of the entry was wrong, because the rescheduling pattern, 2 deferrals, each time by exactly 4 days, matched a behavioral signature that NCIS Counterintelligence doctrine identified as consistent with a collection vehicle holding for an operational trigger event rather than a genuine logistics scheduling conflict. She requested an inspection authorization at 11:49 p.m. She had it at 11:53 p.m. The explosive ordnance disposal team was at Pier 7 at 12:07 a.m. on March 23rd. What they found inside the container required 47 minutes to fully document. The generator components occupied the front third of the container, genuine, functional, professionally packed, a layer of legitimate cargo sufficient to satisfy any cursory inspection that did not proceed to the container's rear section. Behind the generator components, separated by a false partition constructed from the same materials as the container's interior walls, and installed with a craftsmanship that the EOD team leader would later describe as indistinguishable from the original manufacturing, were 18 individually packaged assemblies. The team leader had been an EOD for 12 years. He had worked container inspections in Iraq, Afghanistan, and 3 Horn of Africa postings. He had seen improvised construction, rushed construction, and the particular category of construction that is neither improvised nor rushed, but is instead the product of extended planning, professional fabrication, and a supply chain that had access to materials and equipment that most covert operation cells cannot source. The false partition fell into that third category. Someone had built it in a workshop with the right tools, the right materials, and enough time to do it correctly. The implication of that, the resources, the lead time, the organizational depth required to produce a false partition that a 12-year EOD veteran described as indistinguishable from the original, was a data point that went into his preliminary assessment alongside the assembly specifications. Each assembly consisted of a commercial-grade remotely triggered initiator, a shaped main charge, and a directional fragmentation sleeve. Each assembly had been designed and positioned in the container to be removed and emplaced by a single individual without specialized tools. In under 8 minutes per unit, the initiators used a commercial cellular frequency protocol. The range, 4 kilometers. The trigger, a standard SMS message sent to a pre-programmed number on a SIM card registered to a telecommunications provider in Oman. 18 assemblies, each one sufficient, when properly emplaced, to destroy a USNS ammunition ship moored at a standard logistics pier, or a fuel storage barge, or the berthing structure of a fast combat support ship, or the communications relay station on the camp's northern perimeter, or the satellite uplink facility that managed the encrypted data link traffic between Camp Lemonnier and 5th Fleet Command. The IRGC cell had not been planning a single attack. They had been planning 18 simultaneous ones. The EOD team leader transmitted his preliminary assessment to the Camp Lemonnier commanding officer at 1:02 a.m. The assessment went from the commanding officer to 5th Fleet Command at 1:09 a.m. It went from 5th Fleet to DIA and NCIS headquarters at 1:14 a.m. It went from DIA to the National Security Council Situation Room at 1:31 a.m. By 1:45 a.m., the operational planning meeting that would determine the response was underway in 4 locations simultaneously: Camp Lemonnier, 5th Fleet Bahrain, NCIS headquarters in Quantico, and the NSC Situation Room in Washington. The response had 2 components, and they had to be executed in a sequence that did not alert the IRGC cell that the container had been found. The container was left on Pier 7. The assemblies were left inside it. The false partition was left intact. The pickup was rescheduled from the base's logistics management system to reflect the original March 25th collection date, the date the rescheduling had established before the NCIS flag. The freight manifest entry was annotated as cleared, pending pickup. If anyone with access to the base's logistics management system checked the container's status and the IRGC cell, through whatever access to that system their operational planning had provided, very likely could. They would see a container whose inspection had been completed and whose collection was scheduled. Nothing had changed. The container was fine. The pickup was on schedule. The Pier 7 duty watch was briefed in a room with no windows and returned to their posts without altering their routine by a single observable degree. The second component of the response was the hunt. At 2:17 a.m., the special agent submitted a request to the National Security Agency's collection architecture for a targeted signals collection tasking against the cellular frequency protocol used by the assembly's initiators. She needed to know if any of the pre-programmed trigger numbers had been activated since March 13th, which would indicate that additional assemblies had already been collected and emplaced. And she needed to know the location of any device querying those numbers, which would locate the trigger operator. The NSA tasking was approved and active at 2:44 a.m. The collection result came back in 17 minutes. No evidence of prior activation. The trigger numbers had not been contacted since the container's arrival. The assemblies were still in the container, all 18 of them, but the operator was somewhere. The collection vehicle was somewhere. The IRGC cell that had placed the container on Pier 9 days ago was still in the field, waiting for March 25th at 3:31 a.m. The DIA's counterintelligence element produced an updated assessment based on the EOD documentation and the NSA collection data. The assessment identified 3 components of the operational picture that could be used to locate the cell. The forwarding company whose freight manifest had been used to move the container, the collection vehicle that had made the 2 rescheduled pickup attempts, and the cellular provider in Oman whose SIM cards were registered to the initiator trigger protocol. Working through all 3 simultaneously, the DIA assessment concluded, offered a 72-hour timeline to cell location under normal counterintelligence methodology. The NCIS Special Agent who had found the container read the 72-hour assessment at 3:44 a.m. and began working through all 3 simultaneously, without waiting for the assessment to be translated into a formal tasking. She had been awake for 22 hours. She had 6 cups of coffee on her desk and a threat picture that she understood with the specific, focused clarity of someone for whom the numbers in the EOD report. 18 assemblies, 4-kilometer trigger range, 8 minutes per emplacement, had resolved into a concrete image of what Camp Lemonnier's Pier 7 would have looked like on the morning of March 25th if the container had been collected. The forwarding company's Djibouti business registration traced, through 3 layers of nominee directorship, to a holding entity registered in Oman. The holding entity's registered agent was a firm whose other clients included 2 companies that DIA's existing database flagged as associated with IRGC procurement network fronts. That trace completed at 4:17 a.m. It was the kind of trace that looks straightforward in a summary and is, in practice, 3 hours of cross-referencing corporate registration databases across 2 jurisdictions, each step requiring access request authorizations that the special agent pushed through the NCIS liaison network, with a persistence that the network's overnight duty officer would later describe as the most efficient use of emergency liaison channels he had encountered in 4 years of overnight duty. The collection vehicle, a white panel van registered to a freight logistics firm in Djibouti City, had made both rescheduled pickup attempts. Its license plate had been captured on Camp Lemonnier's entry checkpoint cameras on both dates. The vehicle's registration traced to a firm that had been incorporated 14 months earlier. Its sole director had entered Djibouti on a commercial flight from Muscat on February 17, 2026. 11 days before the February 28th strikes. His entry was documented in Djibouti's immigration database, which the NCIS station had access to through a bilateral law enforcement information sharing agreement. His current location within the country was not documented, but his phone, registered to the same Omani cellular provider as the initiator's SIM cards, had pinged a cell tower in Djibouti City's Balbala district at 11:44 p.m. on March 22nd, 43 minutes before the special agent had flagged the container. She had the cell tower location at 5:03 a.m. She had a joint operational plan drafted with the Djibouti National Police's Counterintelligence Unit, Camp Lemonnier's Force Protection Element, and an NCIS Special Operations Support Team at 5:47 a.m. She briefed it to the Camp Lemonnier commanding officer at 6:02 a.m. He approved it at 6:09 a.m. At 7:14 a.m., Djibouti National Police units, supported by NCIS personnel and Camp Lemonnier's Force Protection Element, established a surveillance perimeter around 3 addresses in the Balbala district that the cell tower data and subsequent signals collection had identified as probable operating locations. The perimeter was established without the knowledge of any occupant of any of the 3 addresses. It was maintained in observation-only mode from 7:14 a.m. until 9:37 a.m., during which time signals collection continued to build the picture of who was present, what communications they were conducting, and whether any additional operational elements of the cell were in contact with the identified location. At 9:37 a.m., the collection vehicle, the white panel van, arrived at the primary address. The driver was the same individual whose immigration record had been identified at 4:17 a.m. 2 additional individuals exited the building and approached the van. All 3 were documented on surveillance cameras. The documentation was sufficient for positive identification and prosecutorial standards. At 9:41 a.m., the Djibouti National Police executed simultaneous entry at all 3 addresses. 3 individuals were taken into custody at the primary address. 2 additional individuals were located at the secondary addresses. All 5 were processed under Djiboutian Counterterrorism Detention Authority within the first 90 minutes of the operation. The search of the 3 addresses produced additional operational materials. A physical map of Camp Lemonnier's Pier layout with 18 numbered emplacement points marked in pencil. A commercial-grade signal repeater designed to extend cellular coverage into the base's Pier 7 area. 3 additional SIM cards from the same Omani provider as the initiator cards, and a handwritten timeline document whose translation, completed by a DIA linguist at 11:14 a.m., described an operation the cell referred to by an internal designation that translated from Farsi as Quiet Harbor. 5 members of the IRGC covert operations cell that had placed the container on Pier 7 were in Djibouti in custody by 9:53 a.m. A 6th individual, whose presence at any of the 3 addresses had not been confirmed by surveillance, was not located. He would remain unlocated for 11 days when he was identified at a border crossing into Ethiopia using a Lebanese passport. A passport whose biometric data matched a facial recognition hit from a customs camera at Djibouti's Mbuli airport on February 17th. Boarding a different flight than the cell director, but on the same day. The container was removed from Pier 7 at 11:22 a.m. by an EOD team working under controlled conditions. The 18 assemblies were rendered inoperable in a methodical sequence that took 4 hours and 9 minutes. The false partition was preserved as evidence. The initiator's SIM cards were extracted and submitted to NSA for exploitation. The shaped charges were cataloged, documented, and their materials composition analyzed. The analysis would confirm, within 72 hours, that the explosive compound matched a specific manufacturing batch that DIA's technical intelligence database associated with an IRGC procurement order placed through a UAE-based industrial chemicals supplier in November 2025. At 2:31 p.m., the Camp Lemonnier commanding officer transmitted his after-action summary to 5th Fleet Command. 1 IRGC Covert Operations Cell, activated in the first week of March with a tasking to pre-position disruptive capability against U.S. military logistics infrastructure in the Camp Lemonnier operating area, had been fully interdicted. 18 explosive assemblies recovered intact. 5 cell members in Djibouti in custody. 1 cell member outstanding. No U.S. personnel casualties. No infrastructure damage. The logistics base at Camp Lemonnier was operational and continued to support 5th Fleet's Arabian Sea and Red Sea operational requirements without interruption. The summary was accurate in every particular. It did not contain the paragraph that could not be written in an after-action summary. The paragraph about a special agent working through a freight manifest at 11:44 p.m., reaching a container entry whose rescheduling pattern matched a behavioral signature she had read about in a doctrine document, and deciding that the match was worth a flag. It did not contain the hours between 11:47 p.m. and 5:03 a.m., during which she had worked through 3 simultaneous investigative threads on 22 hours of no sleep. It did not contain the specific, concrete image that had driven that work. 18 assemblies, 4-kilometer trigger range, 8 minutes per emplacement, and a collection vehicle scheduled to arrive on March 25th. The things that after-action summaries contain are the outcomes. The things that produce outcomes are the decisions made at 11:47 p.m. by people who notice the difference between a pattern and a coincidence. and understand that the difference is not always obvious and is always worth checking. The USNS ammunition ship that had been scheduled to moor at Pier 7 at 6 a.m. on March 25th completed its mooring at 6:03 a.m. on schedule, 3 minutes late due to a tugboat coordination delay that had nothing to do with anything that had happened on that pier in the preceding 12 days. Its crew did not know what had been on Pier 7-9 days earlier. They moored, offloaded, and continued their logistics cycle with the particular, efficient indifference of a crew doing a job they do every week, unaware that the job was possible because someone had looked at a freight manifest at 11:44 p.m. and made a flag that most people in her position would have logged as low priority and reviewed in the morning. The logistics cycle continued. The fuel moved. The munitions moved. The ships that needed to be at sea were at sea, supplied and capable, because the infrastructure that supplied them was intact. Intact not because it was invulnerable, because someone had read a freight manifest at 11:44 p.m. and made a flag. The most dangerous weapon the IRGC placed at Camp Lemonnier was a container that looked like everything else. The most effective defense against it was a person who looked anyway.